Dear loved ones, I'm sitting here with my cold ice cream, glass of water for my dry throat, here to tell you about the history of my family and of myself. These pictures and the stories that go with them will give you a sense of the history of our family. Both sides of the family are people willing to venture into unsettled, unknown territories, to start new lives. Leaving harm because of persecution in the old country or seeking adventure or a better life. This history is a part of me that you have inherited, blending the cultures and the races that make up each of your identities. This picture is of my great-grandmother on my mother's side, Evangelina Purdy. It was taken in 1890 when she was an old woman. She was of German descent and her family settled in West Virginia probably at the beginning of the 19th century. This is my grandmother Cora Purdy. She married Harold Frey, who was a German Jew from Austria. He migrated to this country to escape the persecution of the Jews. However, in order to start a new life when he arrived in this country, he didn't reveal any of his background. It wasn't uncovered until the 1940s when one of his sons decided to trace the family tree. The family was living in Colorado at the time, which was a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan. So, understandably, they were very fearful and a little prejudiced themselves. Most of the family went into total denial and the subject was never allowed to be discussed. There were 7 children in this family and my grandfather supported them with his business as an oil digger. Like many other people living in small rural towns at the beginning of the century, they lived on an acre of land growing their own vegetables and raising chickens. They had an outdoor toilet until the late 1930s, and when I visited as a small child I was always terrified of walking through the chickens to reach the commode. My young aunts and uncles would always laugh at the city girl and her fear of chickens. My grandparents were poor at the beginning, but they prospered later. My mother tells how her mother died at 83 and she came back home to help her brothers settle the estate. They accidentally found $20 bills in books all over the house. My grandmother didn't trust banks and kept most of her money at home. She gave bank books a new meaning. My mother is the petite one in the next picture. She was born on the outskirts of Wheeling, West Virginia in 1899. When she was 10 years old, her family moved to Lamar, a small prairie town in Colorado. My mother describes how she and her 2 sisters wearing big straw hats sat side by side in the smoking car all the way from West Virginia to Colorado. Somewhere during that trip, she decided that Annie Bell was too old-fashioned a name and changed it to Anna. She later came to regret that change, and before she died she made me promise that her gravestone would be marked Annie Bell. She liked school so much that when her family couldn't afford high school tuition for her, she got permission to repeat the 8th grade. She left school at 15 and went to work for a doctor's family as a housekeeper, cook, helper, and nanny. At 18 she met my father and a year later they were married. My father's family came to this country on the first boat over and settled in Virginia. My aunt and uncle always claimed we were descendants of Martha Washington. Their background was Scotch, Irish, and English. This is my great-grandmother McGinnis, Grandma Alice Richey, and 2 sisters. This is their home in Iowa. On the right is my Grandma Alice Richey and on the left my Grandpa Jack Richey. They were living in the Oklahoma Territory when my father was born. Grandma divorced Grandpa when my father was 5 years old, a truly uncommon action at that time. She taught at schools to support herself and her 3 children. No one ever spoke of the divorce, it was rather hush-hush. Yet you can see from the way she stands on that tree trunk that she was a very independent and determined woman. This is 81-year-old great-grandma, Kathleen McGuinness, an Irish name as you can find. My father, Brian Richey. He is between 18 and 21 years old. When he and my mother were first married, they lived in Lamar and he worked in the flour mill, which he hated. They moved to Denver so he could find other work. My father was a hard worker but afflicted with cosmic longings which always pulled him in the direction of finding something better or something new. We moved a lot in the process and I attended 15 schools in 12 years. He was never out of work except during the Great Depression of the 1930s. His pride and sense of responsibility to his family made this inability to find work a very difficult time for him. My mother and father were both survivors and did their best to bring the family together under often adverse conditions, a lesson they certainly passed on to me. My father's sister, Aunt Mabel Richey Adkins. We lived close to her for many years and she treated me like a daughter. Weaving clothes for me, taking me places, and most of all encouraging me that I could be an artist. Now we come to the life and times of Verna, Eleanor, Richey, Pedrin Brown. This little round-headed kid is me at age 1 year. Here's family day with baby in a Denver park. Naturally, I have no memories of either age. I do, however, have memories of the next picture. Taft is one of the hottest places in California. Whenever I went barefoot, I was always trying to stand in my own shadow, thinking the ground would be cooler. It took me a while to learn otherwise, but I was only 3 years old. In the next picture, we were living in Oakland on 56th Street. I was 9 and my sister Thelma was about 15 months. I liked to dress like a tomboy and the beret was to cover up a haircut that I hated. The boyish bob was all the rage at the time, and I convinced my mother against her better judgment that haircut would suit me to a T. Well, I was wrong and had to live with it until it grew out. It was at this age that I learned the stories my father would tell about how things were made or why things would happen. Never true stories, the more graphic and horrible the better. One example was a straight-faced tale of how French's mustard was made of ground-up baby shit. My cousin Betty and I would squeal and gag but encourage him to go on and tell an equally repulsive story. The next picture is on the beach in Santa Cruz. One of the happiest summers we ever had. We lived in Santa Cruz for a year, and all summer long I would take my brother and sister down to the beach where the river flowed into the ocean. The river was calm and not too deep, just right for 3 kids who couldn't swim. My mother was at home very pregnant with my sister Norma and the babysitting was my responsibility. On weekends, my father would come with us and try to teach us to swim by throwing me into the ocean with instructions on what moves to make. To this day, I'm terrified to be in the water where my feet can't touch the ground. Other than that, summer was wonderful. Santa Cruz was still a small resort town where kids could play from morning to dusk and life was like a Norman Rockwell painting. Here we all are again in Taft. Mother, father, brother Glenn and me. Look at those bloomers that come down to my knees. My mother made all my clothes and the bloomers and dresses always matched. I was almost 11 years old before I had store-bought underwear. I had to have my appendix removed and when my mother came to the hospital to take me home she decided it would embarrass me to put on flowered bloomers in front of the 20 kids in the hospital ward, so she brought me a pair of rayon underwear. I was thrilled. We're in Oakland again, standing in front of one of the many cars that my father had owned. He had to have a car to get to work, but it was the family drives that he took us on that made that car important to the rest of us. There was a lot of countryside around Oakland at that time. It wasn't developed or built up, and we would drive up into the hills and pick wildflowers, which was a very exciting thing for us. I'm grown up a bit in this family portrait taken in Buena Vista Park in San Francisco. At 15, I was full of poses. I would rather show you my best profile than look straight at the camera. Here I am at 2 with my doll that still seems to have a head. Most of my dolls had lost their heads either before or after I got them. But I loved them anyway. We're in Taft again in this picture. My mother had brought my brother and me out to where my father was building an oil tank. I'm wearing what was called Dutch boy coveralls, and everyone wore a hat when you went out in that heat. The classic elementary school picture. I'm in the back row wearing a cynical expression. No one wanted to smile on such a serious occasion. Next, Glenn, Thelma, Norma and I are standing in front of my Aunt Mabel's grocery store in Oakland. I worked there the summer I was 17 while she took care of my Uncle Bert who was dying of tuberculosis. I worked from 7 in the morning until 9 at night, waiting on customers and stocking shelves. Since I didn't get a lunch break, I stuffed myself with bad goodies. Here's a picture of 2 kids leaning against a Model T Ford. I'm looking nonchalant in a dress and hat designed for me by my Aunt Mabel while my brother is threatening to cry because he's afraid he's going to fall off the tire. Later when I was 8, we lived in this great big house in Denver where I was sure I heard ghosts throughout the night. Here we are sitting safely outside on the brick porch railing. I hated Denver in the winter because of the snow. I had to slosh to school and I could never get my galoshes buckles fastened. After attending 3 different high schools, the end of my formal education is represented by this picture. My high school graduation picture from Polytechnic, class of December 1938. Here I am all grown up, or at least chronologically older, and still hadn't figured out what I wanted to be when I grew up. One of the options I didn't mind was marriage, but I hadn't figured out that you could have sex without marriage. In those days, you were a bad girl if you didn't combine the two. During the feminist movement, the vast majority of young women, no matter what other ambitions they might dream about, responded to the internalized command to marry. Being an old maid was a disgrace to be avoided at all costs. I didn't want my life to be like my mother's, but I didn't know how to avoid it. I was close to 20 when I married. George and I met at a football game through a mutual friend, and he was very persuasive. Here we are about 2 months after Diane was born. I'm almost 21 years old. Starting from the left is my cousin Betty, Thelma, and me posing in our sexy shoes. When I wasn't running around in my pajamas doing my housework and taking care of children, believe it or not, I would dress like this. Here I am looking adoringly at my beautiful children when we were living in Berkeley with my parents in 1949. The same year my father died. I was 28. In my early 20s, my relationship with my father had developed to one where I loved our discussions and even arguments about the current issues of the day. I was a strong believer in many subjects, and so was he. When I was middle-aged, my mother told me he had admired Thelma for her independence and ability to work, and me, for my insightful and stimulating mind. It was praise I treasured. Here I am holding Steve at age 2, and me at 35 looking very matronly. This is teenage Steve, who had just returned from Cuba and was wearing one of his many disguises as a revolutionary. Here I am in all my happiness on my wedding day in August of 1989. The park was perfect, the weather was perfect, the catering was perfect, and I wouldn't trip over tree roots while walking down the path to join Tom and the wedding party. Social justice has always been a reigning influence on my life. Whether it was going to demonstrations, picketing, going to Cuba to see firsthand a socialist revolution, or the fantastic story of Greece, my concern has always been for justice and a fair society for all people. This is my passport picture, I am 52 and on my way to Greece to participate in the resistance movement against the military dictatorship of Greece with its widespread use of torture. They asked me if I'd be willing to help in a rescue effort. One of the leaders of the resistance movement inside Greece had been imprisoned and tortured by the government. His rescuers needed a safe house rented by an innocent-looking middle-aged woman who could provide a good front. I fit right into the role, but it was scary at times. Adventure always draws me in, even when it also scares me. Next is a happier moment. My 60th birthday party. Aging has never distressed me, although I don't like the aches and pains that often come with it. If you live slowly and in the moment, age brings experience and wisdom. Hard-earned but useful tools to help you live out your life. I see age as a celebration of life and the spirit. The last picture is with a man who has given me the happiest 6 years of my life, taken last year of Tom and me in our backyard. Matt asked me what I thought about what would happen to me after death. I'm a spiritual person, but I don't have a connection to traditional religion or a belief in God. An experience I've had 3 times in the past 30 years is a place to start explaining my beliefs. Each of the 3 times, I've been outside, either walking along the street or sitting in the park. A very strong sensation of being one with the world and all living things, flowers, trees, birds, humans flow through me. They seem transparent to my body and be a part of all this life around me. A tremendous peace and contentment fill me. A small part of that peacefulness is integrated and stays with me. I believe that we're all connected to all other humans through a pool of collected unconsciousness, or spirit. We draw on it in life and we replenish it at death. The body is the vessel that carries us around during life, and at death the spirit leaves and returns to the pool. We each contribute to this vast resource of collective strengths and weaknesses. I think that when we're alive we draw on this collective spirit to form the person we are. Within the limitations and circumstances of our birth and parenting, we make choices about what kind of person we want to be. There is an old proverb that says, "Be careful of what you ask of the universe, for it will come to you, and that is who you will be." The sense of connection after death is very strong for some of us. My father's spirit stayed with me for many years. To my children, Diane, Dan, and Steve, who have given shape and meaning to my life, and over time made me a better parent. To my grandchildren, Justine, Matt, Joaquin, and Maya, you are my joy and delight. To Jenny, although not my birth daughter, has through love and caring become my daughter. And to my dearly beloved Tom, my spirit is there to be drawn on when needed for comfort and support.
I love you all.